In our first episode in A World Without the US, we looked at the ways that World War II and the post-war era might have turned out if the US had simply refused to engage the world and remained isolationist. We discovered that there would be a near certainty of a World War II that ended with a stalemate heavily favoring Germany and positioning it for unrivaled superpowerdom in Europe. We also saw how US non-interference in Korea would have led to a unified and communist Korea with strong ties to the USSR and China, prompting a resurrection of the Japanese imperial state. Today, we're going to see what might have happened if the US exited the world stage at various points in history after the post-World War II era. Iranian democracy. Without the US's interference in Iran, the revolution that brought down the monarchy and ushered in a fundamentalist government may not have played out the way it did in our world. In fact, a revolution which would end up with a religious fundamentalist government may have never been necessary in the first place, were it not for US and British interference in 1953 that saw a democratically elected prime minister ousted by a military coup d'etat organized by MI6 and the CIA. Britain, who owned a majority share of the Anglo-Persian oil company, today BP Oil, saw their continued ownership of the Iranian company as vital to their national interests, as it helped alleviate their budget shortfalls and also powered their oil-fired navy. However, Iranians began to chafe that the British continued to be the primary beneficiary of the company's revenues, and in 1953, newly elected Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry. This did not sit well with the British at all, and they immediately besieged the US for help in overthrowing Mossadegh. Initially, the US was opposed to the idea and saw the British as meddlesome and destructive to the nation of Iran. But when Britain claimed that Mossadegh may in fact draw close to the Soviet Union, an unlikely event, the British played to President Dwight D. Eisenhower's worst fear, communist expansion around the world. Thus, he approved the overthrow of Mossadegh, and the CIA and MI6 immediately went to work, manipulating the Iranian public into supporting the Shah's removal of Mossadegh from his democratically elected position. Without the US, Britain would have been unable to remove Mossadegh from power, which would have resulted in a crippling blow to the British economy as it lost its controlling share of one of the largest oil companies in the world. Iran's own economy would have flourished, as would have its democratic values, as popular leaders such as Mossadegh cultured a strong, secular, and socially aware Iran that year by year ate away at the political power of the Shah. In many respects, Iran could today resemble Britain, a strong democracy with a nobility that serves as nothing more than figureheads who wield no real political power whatsoever. Seeing its own values reflected in a strong Iranian democracy, the US would have seen Iran as a regional partner rather than the potential foe it's considered today, as a counterbalance to the growing influence of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. With the Persian Gulf being the main tap for the global oil supply, the European democracies would have vied to establish strong ties with Iran, and while the Soviet Union would have sought to strengthen its own ties with Iraq, both sides vying for political influence in the most oil-rich region in the world. The reason why is simple. While contrary to popular opinion, today's governments of the West don't plunder Middle Eastern oil for their own benefit. Rather, a strong influence in the region gives them the strategic capability to shut off the oil tap for potential enemies, such as China or Russia. In essence, one side could shut off the flow of oil to the other side in the case of a war, and that's what makes the Middle East so strategically important to the world. With Western Europe and the Soviet Union vying for influence and power in the Middle East, it would have inevitably led to massive Middle East war. While it would likely not have been of a scale appropriate enough to term World War III, the US's exit from the Middle East would have without a doubt launched a regional conflict to rival any of the largest European wars. During the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, the Soviet Union heavily supported Iraq, and after the war, Iraq was sitting on piles of Soviet hardware and a huge national budget deficit. This would lead to the invasion of oil-rich Kuwait, and in our world, this invasion was stopped by a US-led coalition. In a world where the US decided to simply walk away from the world, though, Iraq would have very quickly turned its attention on regional rival and very oil-rich nation Saudi Arabia. At the time, Saudi Arabia relied heavily on US protection, and the US saw Saudi Arabia as not just a vital economic partner, but a vital strategic partner as well, whose location allowed the US to ensure it could control the global oil tap in case of war against Russia or China. The US thus supplied much of the Saudi military and even helped train it, and when Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was Saudi Arabia who saw the first US troops land, and were immediately dispatched into defensive positions to protect Saudi Arabia's oil wealth, while the Saudis' own military largely remained a supporting and token force. Without the US, however, Saudi Arabia would have never been able to withstand an Iraqi attack, who would have plundered Saudi wealth in order to pay off its massive deficit incurred by the almost decade-long war with Iran. Seizing Saudi oil supplies, Iraq would have become a regional superpower, firmly entrenched with the Soviet Union and, in effect, giving the Soviets control over the majority of the world's oil supplies. Western Europe would have immediately financed a war against Iraqi aggression in a bid to avert this strategic catastrophe. But without U.S. firepower and military coordination, the coalition that took out Saddam's forces in the first Gulf War would have been dramatically underpowered. Throughout the campaign, it was U.S. intelligence and recon assets that coordinated coalition attacks, and U.S. stealth aircraft who launched crippling blows against what was at the time one of the world's most formidable air defense networks. Equally important, though, was American pressure on Israel and the efforts of U.S. troops to hunt down Iraqi Scud launchers targeting Israel that prevented that nation from retaliating against Iraq, and thus upsetting the rest of the Islamic states in the coalition, tearing the alliance apart. Soviet military assistance would have flowed directly into Iraq, possibly even extending into actual combat assistance, such as that provided to China during the Korean War against the U.S. In our world, the presence of overwhelming American firepower at the head of a huge international coalition kept the Russians out of the Gulf War. But in a world without the U.S., the international coalition against Iraq would have been decidedly weaker, and victory much more achievable for Iraq. The Soviet Union would have thus thrown its full support behind Iraq, with little fear facing retaliation from the comparatively much weaker Western European nations. After an Iraqi victory and the seizing of Saudi Arabia's vast oil wealth, a healthy stream of very lucrative oil contracts would have flowed into the Soviet Union, enriching it economically and perhaps averting its eventual collapse. Cuba-centric South America. Almost from the moment Fidel Castro took power and ousted the US-backed dictator ruling Cuba, the United States tried to remove him from office. Yet in a world without the US, Cuba would have been free to export its revolution abroad, targeting neighboring countries with its communist revolutionary fervor. Here in the real world, though, the US failed to remove Castro from power, yet it was very successful at limiting or outright countering the influence of Cuba's revolutionaries in other nations. For decades, the US and Cuba, backed by the Soviet Union, fought an undeclared war of influence, and sometimes actual weapons, in countries throughout South and Central America. The US, fearful of communist expansion in its backyard, did all it could to eliminate that threat, even going so far as to depose democratic governments, such as it did in Chile when its governments became too friendly with communist Cuba or the Soviet Union. Without the US, however, communist influence would have spread across the southern part of the Western Hemisphere, and today Central and South America would likely be made up of communist states and a small number of very communist-friendly democracies. Many dictators and the brutal atrocities they committed while in power against their political enemies would not have arisen or maintained power. Without US support, Chile's own General Augusto Pinochet would never have succeeded in overthrowing the democratically elected Salvador Allende and gone on to become one of South America's most oppressive dictators. The Soviet Union survives and wins the Cold War. If the United States had decided to pull all its troops home after World War II and taken no interest in global politics, there's no doubt that the Soviet Union would have won the Cold War against the democratic West. Without American firepower in Europe, the Western democracies would have been forced to stand alone against the Soviet juggernaut, which vastly overshadowed European forces in both scope and capability. The titanic political clout of an unchallenged Soviet Union would have easily bent even France and Britain to its will, lest they face the wrath of the largest mechanized force in world history all on their own. For decades, the United States carefully outmaneuvered the Soviet Union on the international front, resulting in a stunning defeat of the Soviet Union after it was completely economically isolated from the rest of the world. The Soviet Union always fielded a greater number of forces, and the United States always relied on superior numbers of nuclear weapons to keep a parity of power between the two states. However, the end result of decades of sly US international maneuvering was a world where the Soviet Union's greatest economic allies were the small third and second world governments it had backed in Vietnam, Korea, and other places, leaving the Soviet behemoth slowly starving as the world preferred trade with the US and its allies over the Soviets. Without America, the Soviet Union would have been the greatest economic power in the world, and profit alone would have encouraged the nations of the world to trade with it. This great economic clout would have made an untouchable superpower, and given it enough influence to economically isolate Western democracies in much the same way that the US did to the Soviet Union in our world. Interestingly enough, though, rather than Japan remaining a hardline communist power, the Soviet Union would likely have resembled a more modern-day China than the communist stalwart we know from the Cold War. Much like China, its growing exposure to global trade would have seen it relinquish central control of the economy in exchange for dramatic economic growth. As China today, the Soviet Union of a world without America would have been a political communist power with a free market system. Nukes everywhere! The greatest casualty of a world without the US, however, would have been the cause of international nuclear peace. Today, US allies from Japan to South Korea to even Britain and Germany all live under the protection of the American nuclear umbrella, with the assurance that a nuclear attack against one of the US's protected states would result in an American nuclear response. While Britain and France still choose to remain nuclear independent, the American nuclear umbrella has ensured that the majority of nations it covers see no need in pursuing a nuclear weapons program, resting secure in the knowledge that no matter what, the US will abide by its promise to protect its allies. A purposeful strategy, the US has for decades shouldered the burden of protecting other nations, knowing that by doing so, it could limit the threat of nuclear proliferation. Less nuclear-capable states in the world means that the world at large remains safer from the threat of nuclear war. Yet, without the US, many nations around the world would desperately seek out nuclear weapons of their own. Britain and France, who already have a small nuclear arsenal, would dramatically increase the number of nuclear weapons they each hold, especially in light of how powerful the Soviet Union would have become without the US to counterbalance its military and political influence. The Soviets themselves proved to be less concerned with nuclear proliferation than the US, and would have likely done little to prevent regimes in places such as Syria and Libya from developing their own nuclear weapons. Even today in our real world, despite assurances of protection from the US, nations such as Jordan and Saudi Arabia both desperately want their own nuclear programs, and Turkey has long sought for NATO nuclear weapons to be under its own control, something the US flat out denied. With the threat of a rising China and a nuclear North Korea, Japan remains confident that it can rely on its American allies. Yet without the US, Japan would have been forced to develop its own nuclear weapons program. In the real world, a Japanese government internal document even went so far as to hypothesize how quickly Japan could develop its own nuclear weapons if it decided it needed to. A world without the US would look vastly different than the one we know today, perhaps better in some areas and vastly worse in others. Like any other nation, the US has its fair share of villainous and heroic deeds alike, though the consequences of its actions are magnified on a greater scale than any other nation due to its power. Still, given the state of the world today, it can be hard to argue against the course the US has plotted throughout the 20th century, despite the many missteps along the way. Today, the US stands as the world's sole superpower after defeating the Soviet Union, and now at last is the time for Americans to demand that the US acts true to its declared values, as it'll likely never have this opportunity in history again. What do you think a world without the US would look like? What other crazy what-if scenarios can you think of for us to explore? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.